Guys, today I'm going to be talking about the work of Kurt Goldstein, his book The Organism. As kind of a transition from, I've been talking a little bit about some of the work of Max Wertheimer, who was the original founder of Gestalt theory, of the Berlin Gestalt psychologists. And so Kurt Goldstein comes from that kind of legacy. He himself was not a Gestalt psychologist, but he worked with them, and he was very well versed in the work of the Gestalt psychologists. He was a link in the chain from them to others that followed. He was a link in the chain between them and Fritz Perls and Laura Perls, of the founders of Gestalt therapy. And Kurt Goldstein was also someone that Merleau-Ponty was told about. And Merleau-Ponty is someone whose works I'm going to be really diving into this year. Just going to do a few videos on Goldstein before I get there. But it was Kurt Goldstein who really was just a very important link in the chain of humanism, of humanistic theory in psychology, humanistic approaches to therapy. He was the originator of the term self-actualization, which I'm going to just talk about super briefly at the beginning of this video. But this book, The Organism, it can be debated how much it differed from and critiqued and expanded Gestalt theory of Max Wertheimer. But I think in effect it definitely did. Max Wertheimer had some resentment against Goldstein for some of how he portrayed Gestalt psychologists in this book, how he critiqued them. But I do think that whatever commonalities I see in the perspective of Wertheimer and Goldstein, I do think that what Kurt Goldstein really emphasizes in this work was not emphasized enough in the work of the Gestalt psychologists. So I think it's definitely an important work to talk about, not just in itself, but in its legacy and as a link in the chain as we get on to the works of Maurice Merleau-Ponty in philosophy and psychology. So I'm going to do a series of about 4 videos on just a few of the chapters of this book. So the very first part of this video, I'm actually going to talk about chapter 5 because that's where he mentions self-actualization a bit. But really this video is going to be about chapter 6. And then the next video will be chapter 7, then chapter 8, and then the 4th video I'll make on this book is going to be about chapters 9 and 11, which are pretty short chapters. So basically this book, its thesis is really that we need to pay attention to organisms as a whole and how they self-actualize, how they have kind of consciousness and will and a tendency to make choices, not just about stimulus and response, but really a more holistic sense of like goals and personality and kind of essence of a thing. Rather than just kind of basic stimulus and response, which in some ways is very much what Gestalt is all about. Its goal is really what Max Wertheimer has always talked about from the beginning. It's about holism and the thing as a whole. But he makes the critique that the Gestalt psychologists had gotten kind of lost in seeing only systems within the person, within the organism are a whole. And he says, no, we need to really pay attention to humans as organisms that really are wholes, not just the mind as a whole or parts of the mind as a whole or parts of the nervous system. We need to enlarge our vision a bit more. So I'll just read through the different chapters. Chapter 6 is called On the Conception of the Organism as a Whole. It's where he talks a little bit about that. Next video, I'll talk about chapter 7, which is certain essential characteristics of the organism in light of the holistic approach. Chapter 8, on Gestalt psychology and the theory of the physical Gestalten. That's where he makes his criticisms about the virtues, but also the limitations of what was being studied and put out there by the Gestalt psychologists of Berlin and how they were talking about physical gestalts. He I'm not totally sure how to even really pin down what his critique is, but he basically found them to be too materialist. And Merleau-Ponty would later say something similar. I'll do my best to communicate what those critiques are when we get to that video. Chapter 9, the nature of biological knowledge, and Chapter 11, on life and mind, the problem of organismic hierarchy. So first, I do just want to talk about a really, really important concept when we're talking about Kurt Goldstein, and it's mentioned in Chapter 5 of The Organism. It's the concept of self-actualization. So I'll just kind of read this quote. To introduce it, I just want to kind of explain that this is really what he is all about. The emphasis of what I'm going to be talking about in these videos is less so on self-actualization, but it's very much tied into it. It's tied into the concept of an organism as a whole, and it's very important to Goldstein's legacy. So I'll just kind of mention it. So the quote, "Normal behavior corresponds to a continual change of tension, of such a kind that over and again that state of tension is reached, that enables and impels the organism to actualize itself in further activities according to its nature. Thus, experiences with patients teach us that we have to assume only one drive, the drive of self-actualization, and that the goal of the drive is not a discharge of tension. Under various conditions, various actions come into the foreground, and while they thereby seem to be directed towards different goals, they give the impression of independently existing drives. But in reality, however, these various actions occur in accordance with those instrumental processes that are then necessary prerequisites of the self-actualization of the organism." So something that he's going to kind of talk about later as I talk about Chapter 6 is the fact that, like, it's not always just as simple as an organism seeking the easiest way out or a relief. Sometimes you're going to tolerate pain because there's something greater, something more tied to your values, to your self-actualization, to your sense of self, what you believe and who you are, that will override a more simple resistance to pain, for example. And so this is kind of a tension between the eventual tradition of like person-centered therapy and Gestalt therapy. They each have kind of their own focus on like self-actualization versus equilibrium and adjustment. I think there's so much that they have in common, but I think arguably Kurt Goldstein is diverging a bit from the Gestalt psychologists in how he wants to really talk about personality and conscious decisions that we make that are tied to kind of more existential qualities of a human person, not just how does this organism try to maintain their equilibrium against like resolving tension. I think both sides of the coin are very important to talk about, and I think they can be reconciled with a sense of like both and. So a lot of what Kurt Goldstein says I find merit in, and I don't always know exactly where I stand as far as am I more on his side of things or the Gestalt psychologist side of things. I think they both have really important perspectives. The only other thing that I'll mention before we get to Chapter 6, which is what we're talking about today, he just also kind of concisely mentions his framework and his thesis in Chapter 5 when he talks about a synthesis framework rather than parts. It's just the same kind of principle of the Gestalt psychologist of Max Wertheimer, is to see the whole of things rather than to build parts as if we can just have stackable parts and by that we can reach our knowledge of the whole. Sometimes you can't just reduce things. So his quote, "The aim, explanation of life through causal analysis, must be abandoned once and for all. In order to explain life, synthesis is necessary. It cannot be denied that the problem of synthesis, involving the relationship of the parts to each other and to the whole, becomes a scientific task of the first order. Our endeavor is to reach a more positive determination of the approach from parts to whole." So he's basically saying in this book we're trying to determine what is the approach that can look at the whole of things, not just to build parts on top of each other. So a good way to kind of summarize his his outlook and the outlook of the Gestaltists is synthesis. All right, so now we're going to talk about chapter 6, which is called On the Conception of the Organism as a Whole. Got a lot of quotes, just like the videos that came before this one. I'm mostly just kind of typing out the quotes and reading and kind of explaining them to you, but I really want to be centered around the text itself. So I'll just kind of read through these. The first one, reflex investigations, as well as the observations of the behavior of patients with brain lesions, have repeatedly taught us one thing: the relationship of each individual performance to the whole organism. So a lot of the examples that he talks about in this book, he will relate it to the question of like reflex investigations, because that had been really predominant at the time, is this idea of just like automatic kind of reflexes, like 2 + 2 = 4, stimulus response. And so he wants to talk about how with something like a brain injury, he worked with patients who had been veterans who had experienced brain injury. Does localization of a certain injury always equal the same result or not? He says it doesn't. There are other factors. There's a whole system that influences how a brain injury will kind of affect someone, what you will observe in that person with the brain injury. So this kind of leads into the next bullet point. He says, any change in one locality is accompanied by a change in other localities. Third, the stimulus effect is determined by the functional significance of the stimulus for the organism. And fourth, there are situations in which an individual endures pain, for example, for the sake of a higher interest, which is what I did kind of mentioning before. It's not as simple as, we're not machines. Just because we have some kind of injury or just because something happens that is painful, it doesn't always mean we're just these simple creatures that you can calculate how we're going to respond. There's a whole system here, and when we think about our values and our priorities, one person might respond differently to something than another person does. And so just continue with the quotes as we go through this chapter. At one point he mentions the total situation, the meaning of the total situation. We'll see this again in this book. This is something that is very much a reference to like the theory of Max Wertheimer. That's what Max Wertheimer was all about, is the total situation, which I mentioned in my last video. Next quote, the various phenomena in different fields form a unitary whole. All these facts indicate the existence of the relation of any reaction to the whole of the organism. Changes that can be noted in various regions of the organism are never independent of one another. Rather, they stand in a very definite relation to one another. They constitute a functional unit. So there's something about the whole that is different than just all of these parts put together. When they're seen in one system, they all influence each other. They can't just be separated. And last bullet point here, impediment in one part of a reaction disturbs its total course. For a hand tremor to exist, a definite configuration of the rest of the body is necessary. So basically, you wouldn't think about it, but he did research, and for something like a hand tremor, it would go differently if another part of the body was held still. And so it's this idea that we can think that something that's happening is isolated, but actually we would be surprised by how an influence in another part of the body influences what we see. So that was just kind of one example. He has so many examples in this book of things that he had found in research, of different things that they did to notice how all these different symptoms of injuries in the body and vision and cognitive injuries. They did a lot of studies with that. That's not my focus. I'm really focused on the philosophy of all of this, but that's what a lot of this book is filled with. And that's why I wanted to focus more on some of these later chapters of the book, because it gets a bit more philosophical towards the end. But this chapter is very, very important to him, just kind of laying out his thesis of the book, the idea of an organism as a whole. He says then, one unfamiliar with the structure of human walking, one who did not know that arm, leg, and head movements belong together, would say that in the process of walking, different things occur simultaneously, whereas it is a unitary performance. So many of these quotes are all saying the same thing. Instead of isolating different parts of the person, of the organism, you have to see it as one organism, because something like walking, it's not just stackable parts, it's not just the sum of parts, it's a whole performance that is one. It's one. Next quote, every reaction is a Gestalt reaction of the whole in the form of a figure-ground configuration. I won't go too much into explaining that, but that is basically an example of how he's really founded on Gestalt theory. He's founded on the idea of a whole Gestalt. And that word is something that is hard to explain. It's something I, in my first video on the history of Gestalt psychology, kind of talk about the development of the term Gestalt. And he uses the term figure ground, which is essential to Gestalt. But I think as I get through this chapter, it'll come up again and I'll kind of explain more about what that means. For instance, this next quote, he says, we really must always speak of a reaction Gestalt that comprises the entire organism. As we have discussed, one can differentiate in this Gestalt, although only in a certain abstract sense, between two components, the figure and the ground. So he's kind of explaining here that in order to meet our needs, in order to self-actualize in the present situation, we have some kind of thing that we must try to do, and it's kind of this Gestalt, and it's not just composed of its parts. And so by that it means, like, if I need to move and you keep one of my arms down, it wasn't just that I needed to move this arm, it's that I need to get this energy out, and I can do that this other way instead. So it's not just about kind of this material, this physical reflex or stimulus. It's just kind of this principle. There's this principle, this kind of Gestalt that I am trying to do. How can I achieve that? I can have different options to achieve it. And if something is inhibiting me in one way, I will try to meet that need this other way, if that makes sense. And so he talks about figure and ground throughout this book as well, and I'll try to explain that more as it comes up. Next quote, a definite configuration of excitations in the entire organism, especially in the nervous system, corresponds to any single movement, as well as to any performance of the organism. Next quote, we are facing the problem of how to explain volitional performance in general. The intention of a volitional performance, like a volitional facial movement, means a very definite attitude of the organism towards certain demands of the environment. I like this quote. I think it's a good one because it really points out that he's not talking about just kind of like automatic, simple responses. He's talking really about like the will, consciousness, and about the attitude of the organism. Next, the explanation of innervation becomes part of the general problem of the adjustment of the organism to the environment. In fact, of the origin of a specific form of coming to terms with the world. And I know this quote's kind of hard to make sense. What was he talking about with innervation? I just want to pay attention to how he is concerned with the adjustment of the organism to the environment, and also this phrase of coming to terms with the world. So these are principles that are shared among like Gestalt, person-centered, and existential theories, approaches to the human person. And so Kurt Goldstein is again a link in that chain. He wants to bring the focus from these kind of mechanical, very specific considerations of like, how does our brain work, to like, how does our brain work also just as far as we are part of a person. It's not just like this organ, it's this person, this organism that has consciousness, that has their own kind of existential experience and how they are responding to the world around them. And each of us is kind of unique in that way. We're not the same. We're not all cookie cutter. 2 + 2 = 4, if that kind of makes sense. He is definitely existential, and he contributed in ways to the development of the field of existentialism. Next quote, the total excitation pattern is not confined to a definite anatomical structure, but represents a definite excitation gestalt that can utilize for its course any available structure. So just to pause there, that's what I had been saying. It's like a gestalt is this idea that there's some kind of need that I am meeting, something that appears like a figure in my mind of like, oh, this is what comes next. This is the thing that I have to chase or carry out next. And so if it's like energy, the release of energy, I can do that different ways. If I try, it's not as simple like my arm is responding to a stimulus. It's that I'm going to think about how I want to do something. If you're holding one arm, I can still do it with this other arm. I can let out that energy, that movement, just as a very basic example. So to continue with the quote, the performance is based not on the activity of certain mechanisms, but on certain potentialities of the organism that realize themselves by utilization of all sorts of substitute means when the normal means are out of order. So, such as when there's an injury, the organism will compensate in some way to try to achieve that thing that it wants to do. Next, he's just, again, I'm pointing out, he's referencing the idea of the total situation, which is very Max Wertheimer, a performance that results from the total situation. This slide is about questions of localization and specificity. This is what a lot of this chapter is about, is answering kind of this question of like, can we just talk about these different parts of the brain and account for why people do things based on how their brains are and how brain lesion here leads to a certain outcome? Can we just be very 2+2 about all of that? How much does it vary based on the individual? That's what he says when he says, are there specific tissues, nerves, sense areas in the brain? Who would wish to doubt the special difference of liver, stomach, heart, brain, and its substructures, and so on? Yet we shall see later that this doubt is not altogether as absurd as it first seems. The theory of localization of mental phenomena is historically connected with the names of Franz Josef Gall, Bouchard, Dax, father and son, and especially Paul Broca and Karl Wernicke. Innumerable papers have been written concerning the minute construction of brain maps that were supposed to demonstrate the relation of certain performances to circumscribed brain areas. He says, it renders rather unsatisfactory service to determine simply the location of a brain lesion. It can basically only tell us so much. It has its limit as to how helpful it is to talk about localization in the brain. I'll continue reading the quote. Whether a certain symptom will appear on account of a local injury, especially whether it will become a permanent symptom, certainly depends on many other factors, on the nature of the disease process, on the condition of the rest of the brain, on the state of the circulation, and on the psychophysical constitution of the patient. It also depends on the difficulty of that performance, the disturbance of which represents the symptom, and finally on the reaction of the entire organism to the defect. So he says just talking about where the location of the brain injury is, that alone doesn't tell us everything we need to know. It doesn't determine everything about how it's going to be experienced by the patient. Next quote, localization of a performance no longer means to us an excitation in a certain place, but a dynamic process that occurs in the entire nervous system, even in the whole organism, and that has a definite configuration for each performance. The question remains whether we should not have to assume specific substances or processes for such definite qualities as color, tone, and so on, complying with the so-called theory of the specific energy of the senses. So he's making a reference here, and I don't know as much about it to really adequately describe it, but he's making a reference to the thought of others that had basically said, for things like color, tone, the way that our minds pick up on it, it's almost like these stackable parts. It's not very complex. It's just there are these kind of principal things in ourselves that help us pick up on these. And so it's very kind of localized. It's this idea that more complex perception is just based on the sum of these more essential qualities of perception, our ability to perceive color, tone, etc., a few other things. More complicated perception is basically thought of as just like the sum of those parts. I know that doesn't adequately explain it, but just wanted to kind of do my best to explain what he's referencing there from other thinkers. And so the Gestalt psychologists as well were reacting and criticizing this more simplistic atomistic perspective that Kurt Goldstein is also critiquing. He says, what we call sensation in a special sense modality is but a very complicated special instance of a total reaction pattern of the organism during its coming to terms with those events of the environment that demand sensory experience. So he's basically just kind of resisting this idea that it's a sum of more simple parts. He's saying it's a total reaction pattern of the organism. When we have sensation, we're not just stacking these more primary bits of perception of color and tone. It's a total reaction that involves more. And he's going to talk about that in this next quote a bit. He says, even the bare content of perceptual experience is by no means exhausted in sheer sensory content, as color, for example. Other experiences are probably still more important in normal life, for example, all that we generally call mood or atmosphere into which we are brought by a certain sensory stimulus. I really like this point. He's basically saying sensation means more than just this basic perception of like color or tone. It can also be that we are ushered into a certain atmosphere or mood when we receive a sensory stimulus. And so there's this total reaction of an organism when there is a sensory experience. It touches on different parts of us, and he's going to continue with this in the next slide. Artists especially, for example, Goethe and Kandinsky, have not only recognized this effect of sensory stimuli, but have considered it to be the essence of perception. Our language contains manifold traces of such experiences, as, for instance, when we talk of the softness, the gaiety, the vigor of a color, of its coldness, of its piercing character, and similar attributes. Such experiences are particularly pronounced when the objectifying attitude is not as much in the foreground as is customary, either because of the situation or some lack, as in disease. I really like this quote, and I think there's a lot there to talk about. But he's just kind of saying that when we have an experience of a color, for example, we're not just perceiving the color. In our perception and our sense of sensation, our body might experience this idea of softness, of coldness, of being pierced, vigor of a color. We can have kind of a mood that's based on a color. Our reaction is a total reaction of the organism. It's not a simple, very localized, just part of the brain that is receiving the sensation. And he says that, so this is kind of contrasted with versus like a more objectifying attitude. It's more subjective. And so he says there might be certain situations or certain, like maybe a brain injury, which is what he's used to, that might influence that someone might perceive something differently based on them as a unique organism, as a unique person. It's not that everyone is going to react the exact same way to a certain color being shown to them, like objectively. We know that color perception is more complicated than that. The next quote continues talking about color. He says, we find furthermore that green favors performance in general, in contrast to red. The effect of red probably goes more in the direction of an impairment of performance, in the direction of shock reaction. These different effects correspond, of course, to very definite but different total behavioral attitudes, which find their expression very clearly in the subject's reports of the mood corresponding to the various colors. So here he's saying that we can have a different mood kind of based on the color that we see. Again, just the same point is being made. That green can help us have a sense of energy and performance, and red being shown might have more of an impact in the opposite direction and more of a shock or slowness. And then also he talks about the example of synesthesia, which is a very interesting example to make on related lines. A person might associate colors with something else, with a mood, with a person, might conjure up in one's mind a color for people who have synesthesia. So it's not as simple as I receive the color that I see. It might be associated with a lot more parts of me and my what I'm conscious of, what I have in my memory, what I literally see in my mind. It can be different from person to person. It's not just the object that's out there. It's the total reaction and attitude and the unique system that is me as a person, how I respond to that. He talks more about color here. He's talking about green. He says, what we call green is on the one hand an event in the outside world, and on the other hand a certain pattern of the whole organism, of which the objectifying psychological experience of the color green is only one aspect that is not even absolutely essential, and certainly does not represent the basis of the entire process. So that's kind of what I was just saying. There's an object out there in the world, but that's just one component of the experience. The experience is that is a pattern, is a reaction of the whole organism to the object out there. He says, a specific performance, and thus also a perception, is a specific pattern of the whole organism. For the normal organization of the specific pattern in a so-called sensory performance, those structures are certainly of special importance that we designate as sensory organs or cortical sensory fields. And of course, without them, the specific sense perception does not take place. It is here that the figure process is formed during a sensory performance. Within this frame of interpretation, the assumption of specific sense energies as unique qualitative processes is justified. However, the figure processes tied to the functioning of certain localities gain their specificity only by virtue of the whole process in which they are embedded. Specificity only arises in the whole. So here we have a chance to explain a little bit more about the principle of figure and ground, which is a Gestalt principle. It's the idea that yes, there can be a specificity, but that it arises because of the whole. So the fact that there is this whole ground, in that ground we might see something pop out to us. In a whole room, we see the whole room as this kind of general ground. And my TV might pop out in the focus of my perception. So I won't be able to totally explain all that he's saying in this quote. It's basically just this example of him bringing up the idea that the whole determines the parts. The more specific, the certain part that stands out is only able to exist because of the whole, the larger whole. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say about this quote. I think that's all I wanted to say on that. So he says more about that. He says, the specificity itself arises within the functional pattern of the whole, to which each part, by functioning, contributes a very specific qualitative tonality. So it's just kind of this reversal of the idea that the whole exists as just like the sum of parts. It's these different parts of our body that builds up a person. No, it's that the whole is what allows, for example, my heart to function. My heart couldn't function if it was separated from the whole. The whole is what allows the part to function. So yes, he would say, we can talk about a heart as a heart. It's not that I'm just like this blob without parts. I do have parts, but they are parts within a whole system. So then he says, what justifies us in regarding the state of the isolated heart as the normal state, since it is normally embedded in the whole organism. The normal state of the heart corresponds to its functioning within the whole organism in the given situation, which is basically what I just said. He's asking, why would we talk about the normal state of something as isolated when that's not normally where it is? It's normally embedded in a whole. And so we have to pay attention to the whole organism. It's like, I feel like I'm just repeating myself here, but I'm just kind of explaining what he's all about in this chapter. Again, I'm not in a place to really understand all of the research that he did on brain injuries on his patients and all of that. I'm just here to talk about kind of this philosophical principle that he is talking about here. All right, so here we're getting to the conclusion of the chapter. And he's going to kind of segue here into what he's going to talk about in chapter 7. It's getting a little bit existential. And he's kind of tackling the question of equilibrium. He says, alternation belongs to the normal life process. The organism never lives in a completely adequate milieu, but must continually assert itself against inadequate stimuli. He says there's always kind of constant change, constant adjustment. We're always alternating. Things are basically never adequate for us. We're always being prompted to react against inadequacy in our life. He says, therefore, reactions scarcely ever occur that correspond to a perfectly adequate configuration of the organism and the surroundings. This would be equivalent to an equilibrium state between the organism and the world. In fact, a certain disequilibrium almost invariably exists, for which the organism compensates. He seems to be big here on this idea that equilibrium doesn't really exist in reality. It's something that, yes, we're kind of striving for, but our kind of being in the world is about more than just seeking equilibrium. We do that, but we're doing more at the same time. We're kind of trying to exert ourselves in our beliefs, our values. It's about self-actualization, not just about finding equilibrium. The conclusion of the chapter, he says, this phase-like course is nothing but the expression of slight catastrophic reactions, which are inevitable in the process of coming to terms with the world. It is the expression of the equalization process. It is the way of new adjustments and of finding a new adequate milieu. Where this phase-like course goes beyond a definite or normal limit, it signifies defective behavior of the organism, danger for its performance capacity and for its existence. Then we have serious catastrophic reactions, which are subjectively experienced as shock or as anxiety. Thus we see that the phenomenon of anxiety occupies an important place in the whole process of coming to terms of the organism with the world. So he's kind of leading up to the next chapter where he's really going to talk more about anxiety. He says that anxiety and shock are reactions of an organism to kind of the catastrophic inadequacy of our surroundings. Times when we are really confronted with danger, with a deficiency of what we need in order to kind of react, it might actually react in a way that is a defective behavior, as he says. Somehow there's a reason that we enter into this shock or anxiety, but he'll talk more in the next chapter about how is that helpful, how are we to think about this kind of a reaction of an organism to the world, how can we come to terms with the world, is going to be a bit more existential. So that's what I'm going to talk about more in the next chapter.